The fog came for Elias every evening, not as a whisper but as a slow, inexorable shroud. It crept from the river, swallowing the gnarled branches of the old oaks and softening the edges of his world, until all that remained was a small, isolated circle of lamplight and the rhythmic hollow rasp of his own carving knife. For 20 years, this had been his life, a quiet, ceaseless act of penance. His cabin, a fortress of solitude on the edge of the rushing water, was not a refuge, but a self-imposed prison. He had built it with his own hands, each timber nailed into place a physical lock on the door to his past. His hands, gnarled and powerful, moved with a practiced grace that belied their age. The block of raw pine surrendered to his will, shedding thin, fragrant curls of wood. Slowly, meticulously, the shape of a boat emerged, its hull sleek, its deck a miniature platform of flawless craftsmanship. It was no child's toy. It was a vessel of memory, a silent confessor. Every cut was a syllable of a confession he could never speak aloud, a plea for a forgiveness he believed would never come. The air inside the cabin was thick with the scent of pine and old sorrow. A single, guttering candle cast long, dancing shadows, making the room seem to breathe with a life of its own. He never spoke, not to the rustling leaves outside, not to the birds that nested in the eaves, and certainly not to himself. His voice was a muscle atrophied by 2 decades of disuse, his thoughts a constant, silent monologue of regret. The only sound was the scratch and scrape of his knife, a metronome for a life that had long since stopped moving forward. Finishing the boat, he held it in his calloused palm, a perfect, weightless offering. He ran a thumb along its smooth, polished keel, a familiar gesture of farewell. In the dim light, the wood grain seemed to ripple like the water itself. This was the moment his day culminated, the one ritual that held his fractured life together. It was a sacrament of grief, a desperate attempt to send a piece of his heart downstream, hoping it might one day find its way to a destination he could only imagine. He pulled on a worn jacket and stepped outside. The cold air bit at his skin, but he didn't feel it. He felt only the oppressive silence, a quiet so profound it was almost deafening. The river was a dark, pulsing line on the horizon, its low murmur a perpetual elegy. He walked toward it, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The small boat held carefully in his hand as if it were a fragile bird. Standing on the edge of the current, he hesitated for only a second. He lowered the boat to the surface, its polished hull kissed by the icy water. He let go. The current took it instantly, pulling it away from him, a tiny, defiant speck disappearing into the grey expanse. He watched it go, a knot of familiar pain tightening in his chest. The river was a mirror, reflecting his failures back at him, and for a moment he could almost see his brother's face in the swirling water, a ghost of a memory that was both a comfort and a torment. His days were a quiet, repetitive cycle, a life lived in a single, monotonous key. He rose with the weak light, a habit ingrained from years of wanting to outrun the night's ghosts. He would split wood, his axe swinging with a heavy, practiced rhythm, each blow a dull thud that echoed his own emotional numbness. He tended a small garden, pulling weeds with a methodical precision, as if he could cleanse the earth of its imperfections, and in doing so, somehow cleanse himself. But the roots always grew back, just as the guilt always returned. The river was his constant companion, his confessor and his judge. Its flow never stopped, a relentless march of time that he had tried to halt on that one fateful day. He would sit on a moss-covered rock for hours, watching the water, not really seeing it, but feeling its presence like a hand on his shoulder. It whispered to him of the things he had lost, the future that had been stolen. It was a beautiful and cruel monument, its surface sparkling, in the sun like a shattered memory, its depths hiding a darkness he knew all too well. The cabin was a testament to his isolation, No photographs adorned the walls, no personal trinkets cluttered the shelves. There was only the necessary, the functional. A small wood stove, a rough-hewn table, a single cot. The only artistic expression was the scattered pile of carved boats, the ones that had been rejected, their hulls warped or their keels crooked. They lay in a heap by the fire, a graveyard of failed attempts at absolution. He never ventured into the nearby village. The idea of conversation, of human connection, was an anxiety that sat heavy in his stomach. He was a ghost to the villagers, a shadowy figure who existed only in hushed whispers and vague legends. To be seen was to be judged, and he believed he had already been sentenced. He had chosen this life of silence and solitude because he was certain that no one could ever understand the true depth of his crime or the weight of the water that had swallowed his brother whole. His dreams were a torment of sound and motion, the sound of his brother's panicked scream, the frantic struggle against the powerful current, the final desperate look in his eyes as he disappeared beneath the surface. Elias would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs, the taste of river water in his mouth. He would lie there, listening to the real river outside his window, its steady murmur mocking his helplessness. The cold, wet mist was his most faithful companion. It clung to him as he walked to the river, seeping into his clothes and his skin. It was a tangible representation of the way his memories obscured his life, a soft, suffocating blanket that kept him from seeing the world clearly. It was a symbol of the unresolved nature of his guilt, a constant reminder that he was living in a state of perpetual grey, a world without sun. He was a man defined by a single moment, a snapshot of time that had broken him and then been replayed 1,000,000 times in his mind. He had tried to outrun it, to bury it, to carve it away, but it always came back, an emotional tide that rose and fell with the river's current. His ritual with the boats was the only thing that kept him afloat, a fragile lifeline in an ocean of despair. But tonight, as he watched the boat disappear, a terrible thought took root in his mind. What if it was all for nothing? He felt a deep sense of despair, a hollow ache in his chest that told him his penance was futile. The boats were not freeing him, they were anchoring him to the past, and he was so tired of being anchored. 3 days later, a small, worn figure appeared on the trail leading to his cabin. It was a girl, no older than 9, with bright, curious eyes that seemed too big for her face. She held something carefully in her hands, her movements slow and deliberate. Elias, who was mending a fence post, froze. His first instinct was to retreat, to disappear into the forest like a hunted animal. But the girl did not approach with the boisterousness of a child. She moved with a quiet purpose that held him in place. She stopped a few feet from him, her gaze fixed on his hands, then on his face. She held out the object she carried. It was a boat, one of his boats, its polished pine hull still glistening with river water. It was the one he had sent off 2 nights ago, the one he had felt was a particularly hollow offering. "I found it," she said, her voice a soft, clear bell in the heavy air. "It was lost, so I brought it back." Elias stared at the boat, then at her. He had expected her to ask for a new one, a shiny, perfect one. He had expected her to be a symbol of the world he had abandoned, but she had seen it not as a toy, but as something precious that had gone astray. Her simple act of returning it, believing it to be a lost treasure, was a profound and unexpected blow to his carefully constructed wall of isolation. It was a gesture of profound innocence and empathy. He didn't know how to respond. He hadn't spoken to another human being in years. His throat felt tight and dry, and the words he tried to form were nothing but a rough, painful sound. He looked away from her, his gaze falling to the boat in her hands. The grain of the wood, the curve of the hull, the tiny imperfections he had thought were a sign of his failure. She saw only its value. The girl, whose name he would learn was Lily, wasn't bothered by his silence. She simply stood there, waiting. She had found his boat washed up on a small bank near her home. She had been searching for river stones, and the flash of polished wood had caught her eye. She had cleaned the mud from its surface, not with a sense of ownership, but with a deep respect for the object itself. "It looks sad," she said quietly, her small fingers tracing the keel. Elias's head shot up. He had never considered that anyone could read the emotions he poured into his craft. She wasn't just seeing a boat, she was seeing his grief. Her perception was a sharp needle puncturing the thick protective shell he had built around himself. He managed a single hoarse word. "Why?" he asked, the sound rusty and unfamiliar. "Why did you bring it back?" "Because," she replied, looking at him with those impossibly old eyes, "when something is lost, you're supposed to help it find its way home." Her words were a simple truth, a fundamental law of the universe that he, in his self-imposed exile, had completely forgotten. The statement landed with the force of a physical blow, shaking him to his core. He had been sending his guilt out to sea, trying to lose it, not realizing that he was the one who was lost. If this story has already touched you, imagine what's still to come. Subscribe and don't miss the next one. Lily's visits became a part of the rhythm of his life, a discordant but beautiful note in his symphony of silence. She wouldn't come every day, but often enough that Elias found himself listening for her footsteps on the trail. She never asked for a new boat. She simply brought him river stones, wildflowers, and quiet observations about the world that felt like revelations to him. She spoke of the patterns on a dragonfly's wings, the way sunlight fell through the leaves, the names she had given to the old trees. He would sit and listen, his hands frozen over his carving, the silence between them no longer heavy with his own pain, but filled with her light. One afternoon, she arrived holding a small, smooth piece of river glass, its surface a milky, translucent green. "It's like a memory," she said, holding it up to the light. "The river smoothed it out, but you can still see its story inside." Elias looked at the glass, then at her. He saw the truth in her words. The river had smoothed out the sharp edges of his trauma, but the core of it, the pain, was still there, trapped inside him, a silent weight. Her innocence was a mirror, reflecting his own unhealed grief back at him, but in a way that was gentle, not condemning. The presence of the girl was a constant, low-level tension. It forced him to confront the wall he had built. He started to feel a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time, a small, tentative hope. But with hope came fear. The fear of attachment, the fear of vulnerability, the fear that he would somehow fail her, just as he had failed his brother. He began to feel a familiar panic rise in his chest whenever she would leave, a sudden, cold dread that she wouldn't come back. His solitude had been a comfort. Her presence was a risk. One rainy day, she came to the cabin and found him staring into the fire, the carving knife lying dormant on the table. She didn't say anything, but sat beside him on the floor, her small body curled into a ball. The storm raged outside, the wind howling through the trees, the rain a relentless drumbeat on the roof. "It sounds angry," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the din. Elias nodded. He understood that anger. It was the same anger that lived in his own heart, the anger he held for the river, for fate, for himself. He reached for the carving knife, his hands trembling slightly. He picked up a piece of discarded wood and began to work, his movements slow and clumsy. Lily watched him, her eyes wide with a quiet fascination. He wasn't making a boat. He was just cutting, shaping, letting the wood speak for itself. It was the first time in years he had carved something without a singular purpose of penance. He was creating, not confessing. The simple act felt both foreign and exhilarating, a small rebellion against his own ritual. But the most difficult moment came when she asked a simple question that cut through his defenses like a blade. "Why do you send the boats away?" she asked. The question hung in the air between them, a sudden silence in the middle of the storm. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. He felt the weight of his secret, the suffocating heaviness of it, rise in his throat. He looked at her earnest, trusting face, and for the first time he felt the immense, terrifying urge to confess. He wanted to tell her everything, to unburden himself of the story of his brother, of the drowning, of his eternal shame. But the words were still locked. Inside him, held prisoner by 2 decades of silent grief. He couldn't do it. He turned away, his hands gripping the half-finished carving so tightly his knuckles turned white. The moment passed, leaving a silent chasm between them. Lily, sensing his distress, simply reached out and placed her small hand over his, a gesture of silent comfort. And in that moment, Elias understood that his guilt wasn't a punishment from the universe. It was a cage he had built for himself. And now, this small, innocent girl was offering him a key. The next day, Elias went to the river alone, a different kind of turmoil simmering within him. He had not carved a new boat. He had not slept. He had been haunted by Lily's question, by the simple, profound query that had undone him. He walked to his spot on the riverbank, a knot of guilt tightening in his stomach. He saw a pile of smooth stones near the water's edge, arranged in a small circle, a silent offering from Lily. It was a gesture of trust, a quiet invitation to share his burden. He stared at the water, the familiar ache in his chest, now accompanied by a new, more profound sense of shame. He wasn't just guilty of failing his brother, he was guilty of living a lie, of hiding from the world and from the truth of his own pain. He had made a monument out of his grief, but it was a monument to his selfishness, a way of keeping the memory of his brother contained and controlled. He felt the familiar urge to carve, to perform his ritual, to send another silent boat into the current, but the wood felt lifeless in his hands. He couldn't do it. He couldn't pretend anymore. He sat on the ground, the cold, damp earth seeping into his clothes, and the dam he had built for 20 years finally broke. Tears, hot and stinging, began to fall, tracing paths through the dirt on his face. He sobbed, the sound a broken, unfamiliar thing that seemed to tear at his very core. He was no longer just Elias, the silent man of the woods. He was Elias, the boy who had watched his brother drown. He was Elias, the man who had let a beautiful, fragile thing get pulled under by a cruel current. He cried for his brother, for the life he never got to live, for the laughter he never got to hear. But most of all, he cried for himself, for the man who had chosen to bury himself alive in his guilt. His tears were the rain on a barren land, washing away the dust of 2 decades of silence. The sobs racked his body, each one a release of a memory, a regret, a sorrow he had carried for far too long. He saw it all again, the warm summer day, the daring race to the old rapids, the careless slip of a foot, his brother's panicked face in the churning water. He remembered reaching for him, his fingers brushing against his brother's, a fraction of a second too late. The memory had been a poison in his blood, and now, finally, he was expelling it. He cried until he had no more tears. The world around him, once a silent, punishing landscape, now seemed to hum with a quiet energy. The river still flowed, but its sound was no longer a taunt. It was just a river, a part of the world. The fog still hung in the air, but it seemed less menacing, a simple part of the natural cycle. He had broken, and in breaking, he had finally begun to heal. He looked at the little pile of stones Lily had left him. He picked one up, its surface smooth and cool against his skin. It was just a stone, but it was also a bridge. It was a bridge back to the world, a symbol of a connection he had been so afraid to make. The shame was still there, a dull ache beneath the surface, but it was no longer a suffocating weight. It was a part of him, a scar, a memory. It no longer defined him. He stood up, his legs wobbly, and walked back to the cabin. The fire was out, the air was cold, and the uncarved wood lay waiting. but for the first time in 20 years, he didn't feel the crushing need to carve. He felt something else, a deep, profound tiredness, and a quiet, surprising sense of peace. He had confessed to the only one who mattered, himself. He had stopped running from the ghost in the river and had instead, finally, mercifully, let him go. The next morning, the fog had lifted. The sun, a bright, startling disk, broke through the canopy of trees, illuminating the world in a way Elias had forgotten was possible. He brewed a cup of tea, the steam rising in the golden light. He did not go to the river. He walked to the edge of his property, where the trail began, and began to fix the fence again, this time with a sense of purpose rather than penance. He was no longer a prisoner of his past. He was a man rebuilding his future, one small act at a time. Later that day, Lily appeared. She saw him by the fence, and this time he did not flinch. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw the man beneath the shroud of sadness. He was still quiet, still reserved, but his eyes held a glimmer of something new, a light that had been extinguished for a very long time. She did not bring a boat or a stone. She simply stood there, a small smile on her face. He had no words, but he had an offering. He went to the cabin and returned with a small, perfectly carved bird, its wings outstretched in a posture of flight. It was the carving he had started the day before, the one without a specific purpose. He held it out to her. "For you," he said, his voice rusty but clear. It was the first time he had spoken in her presence, the first time he had given her something that was not a ghost of his grief. She took it from him, her eyes wide with wonder. She looked at the little bird, then back at him. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice filled with a quiet reverence. She understood. The bird was not a symbol of loss or guilt. It was a symbol of freedom, of hope, of a life that was finally ready to take flight. Elias looked at the bird in her hands, and for the first time he saw not a failure but a future. He never carved another boat. The ritual of penance was over. He still lived by the river, and its presence was still a constant part of his life, but it was no longer a monument to his brother's death. It was just a river, a part of the world. Elias had finally understood that forgiveness was not something to be sent away on the current. It was something to be found, here, on the land, in the quiet, simple act of giving something beautiful to another. He had not saved his brother, but in the end, he had found a way to save himself. If this story moved you, you'll find many others here that might change your day. Join us, subscribe, and be part of this journey.